Welcome. Ooh, I got up the stairs, sorry. My name is Bettina Kames. I'm the director of the LRS Art Foundation. And next to me is Kieran Long. He's director of Amos Rex. We are partners on this project, and we decided that we both do the introduction. So I start. And we are very excited for this to happen. We are extremely excited about our panelists. And before we start with the panel, we felt it's also important that we say a few words about our institutions and organizations and why we are hosting such an event. So I will start with LRS, and then Kieran will say a few words about Amos Rex, and then we start with the panel. So LRS is an art foundation at the intersection of art, the latest technologies, and science. We develop projects with the leading artists, leading scientists, computer engineers, thinkers, philosophers of our times. We do predominantly commissions, often with a long R&D, up to a couple of years. We are based in Berlin. We are nomadic, and we activate different spaces in the city, small and large. All of our projects tour globally and reaching an international audience, and our topics are ranging from quantum computing to AI to outer space, ecology, biotechnology. And our very first show in 2019 was with Refik Anadol and with Matt Dryhurst and Holly Hurden. And we're still very proud about that. It was the beginning of LRS. And we strongly believe in artists as agents for not only social change, but also for innovation, especially at the intersection of art and technology. And we strongly believe in the power of the arts and the importance of art institutions to successfully reach out to a wide audience, to build bridges into society about topics like AI or quantum computing, topics that are so hard to understand, complex, and sometimes even frightening. And I want to give you one example. In 2025, we did an exhibition with the French artist Laure Prouvost. She did the French pavilion at the last Biennale at Kraftwerk Berlin, a former power plant, 4,000 square meters. And here you see the pictures. It was a collaboration between one of the leading female artists of our time and the lead scientist and computer engineer of Google AI Quantum, Hartmut Neven, and the philosopher Tobias Ries. The exhibition was called "We Felt a Star Dying" and referred to the complex world of quantum computing. Laure created a world about quantum physics, a world that you could see, hear, feel, even smell. And you didn't need to know anything about quantum, you could just enter this world and experience it. The core of the exhibition was a film, and sequences we altered with quantum data. And for that, we developed our own quantum AI diffusion model, the first model of its kind in the world. In addition, we developed our own educational space and program, including a program about quantum computing, reaching out to high school students in schools in Berlin. The exhibition attracted close to 60,000 visitors and close to 500,000 on our website. It was the start of our Sensing Quantum program, a 3-year program that includes further exhibitions, symposia, publications, and talks, for which we won the Starts Prize of Innovation by the European Commission. So, artists or art institutions and an interdisciplinary discourse is utterly important, more than ever. And despite what you think of this year's Venice Biennale. And it is more important than ever because of how technology is changing this world, our lives, and even our bodies. A massive disempowerment of each one of us. Power is shifting, and we might lose control. That brings me to this panel and event. Every day brings more examples of the ethical challenges posed by AI, from face recognition to voter profiling, brain-machine interfaces to weaponized drones. Just to name some of the immediate challenges and risks of the near future. Last year, I attended a tech conference, and one of the CEOs of one of the leading big tech companies proclaimed that we have about 2 to 3 years to get it right. And that was last year. An initiative like the Schwarzman Center and its ethics and AI lab seems more important and urgent than ever. As we can't discuss everything today, this panel focuses on a very fitting aspect in this art context, and hopefully a positive one. An upward shift in AI, that today it matters more to ask what to build than how to build it. In the times of Claude and other AI tools, this seems to imply a massive empowerment of each one of us. So much seems possible, and artists are often at the forefront of what is possible and thinkable. Hopefully tech, philosophy, and contemporary art will increasingly blend together for a better future. And before I hand over to Kieran, and also before we introduce the panelists, I want to close with a quote by our own LAS charter. And this reads, LAS is an art foundation about the future. We are led by a vision of the future whereby humankind doesn't see itself at the center, but as part of an interconnected whole. Working thoughtfully with technology, science, non-human species, and each other, we envision a more interconnected, empathetic, and fairer planet. So hopefully this panel adds to this. Exactly. No pressure on this side. And with that, I hand over to Kieran.
Thanks, Bettina, and thanks so much to Philip and to the Institute for AI Ethics at Oxford University for this collaboration. It's going to be a wonderful afternoon, and I won't take too much of your time. I wanted to take a moment, though, to introduce Amos Rex. We are partnering with LAS on this project and co-commissioning Natasha's wonderful work that I'm sure you've all experienced downstairs. Amos Rex is an independent contemporary art museum in the heart of Helsinki, and one of the city's most popular and important civic spaces. We make large-scale exhibitions for a very broad public. We opened in 2018 with a show that was not just welcomed over 600,000 visitors to the museum in just a few months, but also set a tone for the institution in engaging with new technological challenges and new immersive exhibition-making methods. This was Team Lab Massless in 2018. This is before Team Lab Abu Dhabi and all of those things, when Team Lab were relatively less known here in Europe. And it set a tone for us that people remember, that engaging with new ways of making exhibitions and new technologies is important to us. But we do more than just that. We also animate our part of the city with a really wide range of projects, from performance to music to fashion to digital culture and, of course, cinema. And we take our role as a civic terrain seriously. Through this diverse programming, we want to give a broad audience imaginative relationships with these new questions facing society, some of which we touched on just now. And the projects you see here, including Studio Drift's Elemental 2019, Ryoji Ikeda a couple of years ago. These are extraordinary technical achievements that have also connected with very large audiences. But after 8 very successful years, we also now want to contribute to moments like this, to build a discourse, to be a node in a network of institutions discussing the possibilities of technology in the future, and of course in artistic practices. I should mention that 2 of the really key people in our team are here today, Ether O'Neill, Irena Campolmi, our curators, who are specialized in this field. Please take the chance to meet them if you can. Many of the questions we're facing, and I'm sure the panel will talk about, are generated by the kind of uneven impact of new technologies, but some are also generated by new political and geopolitical contexts. And in Helsinki, for us, these things are very real. We are on a new kind of eastern border in Europe, defined by the new technological realities of war and conflict and threat, but also new ethical questions around borders, autonomous systems in war, migration, and many other questions. These are more than questions just about AI. They are interwoven with historical identities where we are, past conflicts, new alliances, and so on. Helsinki and Finland, we think, can be a kind of laboratory of these new dynamics. And for Amos Rex, this is a really important moment to try to make the most of that. And to have a relationship, invite a broad public to have a relationship with art in its broadest sense, but also to think about these new dynamics. And I would say the work that Natasha has made downstairs is typical of this. It feels really in our spirit. It's of course irreverent and youthful and sharp, but also a work that tries to understand our relationship as humans with our past and with the cosmos and with each other. And in her work, questions of military technology, of historiography and storytelling overlap with questions of loyalty, identity, and spirituality. Technology is not, for her or for us, a series of advancing frontiers, but kind of part of the scattered wreckage of human life that we use as raw material for the stories we tell about ourselves. And this is something that a spirit that I think Natasha has brought to this project that we believe we can take into the future. It's wonderful to have speakers here who can be far more qualified than I am about many of these questions, and I'm going to hand over to you now, Bettina, to introduce them, but look forward to meeting many of you after the talk. Thanks.
It's really a great pleasure and honor to have you here. I start with Philip, today's moderator, Professor Philip Corrales, founder and director of HI Lab at the Institute for Ethics in AI, University of Oxford, where he serves as McCourt Professor of Philosophy and AI. His research explores reason, agency, and the role of AI in advancing human flourishing, drawing on a background that includes the first joint PhD in philosophy and neuroscience from Princeton University. So big applause for Philip. Followed by Peter Dannenberg. He is a senior software engineer at Google DeepMind, hiding there in the back, where he leads early stage development for Gemini, creating autonomous agents, creative tools, and AI companions with academic training spanning computer science, philosophy, and comparative literature. His work bridges technical AI development with broader questions of agency, ethics, and human inquiry. Big applause for Peter. Then Linda Eggert. Very warm welcome. A big applause. She is assistant professor of philosophy at Stanford University, where her research is in moral and political philosophy. She examines what determines the rightness or wrongness of human actions beyond consequences alone. A Schmidt Science AI 2050 Early Career Fellow, she also studies the ethical implications of removing human agency from central areas of life and work, nothing less. Then we have the amazing Matthew Dryhurst. He's an artist, senior research associate of HiLab and Accelerator Fellow at the Institute for Ethics in AI at University of Oxford. Known for his work on AI policy, copyright, and cultural production. Alongside Holly Hurden, he runs Hurden Dryhouse Studio and will present or is presenting the exhibition Strange Rules in Venice in 2026. And as I said, we are so happy that you have been with LIS from its very, very beginning. Thank you for being here. And joining us virtually is Audrey Tang, Taiwan's Cyber Ambassador and Accelerator Fellow at the Institute for Ethics in AI, University of Oxford. And probably doesn't need any introduction. I will continue, and previously served as Taiwan's first digital minister and the world's first non-binary cabinet minister. A leading figure in civic technology and open source software, Tang helped build participatory democracy platforms, including Taiwan and Join, and received the Right Livelihood Award in 2025. Very warm welcome as well. Thank you for being here. And with that, I hand over to Philip.
Great. Thank you, Bettina, for this very, very generous introduction. It's fantastic to be here. I think I've got the best job in the world. Basically, I just go from beautiful room to beautiful room to talk about big issues such as AI, intentions, protocols, and power. And so, as you might have gathered from the introduction, basically everybody here is either a current or past colleague at Oxford, everybody on the panel, and everyone except Audrey is also a current or past member of HiLab. So, and maybe Audrey eventually will join HiLab as well. So, like that's something to look forward to. And so, my thought is that, in a sense, this is a bit different from lots of other kinds of panels. All right, sure, thank you. In the sense that we could think of this a little bit like a fishbowl lab meeting. So the kind of discussion that I think we're going to have today is exactly the kind of discussion that we have at lab meeting at HiLab all the time. And Matt and I, we recently had faced this kind of embarrassment that we were starting to talk about all these themes in a very animated way in lab meeting, only to then realize that we can't make the topic go stale because we know we're about to go to Venice to do that with lots of other people. And so we had to kind of rein ourselves in. And so, but since this isn't just sort of a regular panel discussion, but we want this to feel a bit more like a lab meeting, including everybody, I actually want to start with the audience. If everybody could raise their hands for me, please. Thank you. And lower your hand if you have at least one AI agent running on your behalf right now as we speak. Lower your hands if you've ever built an AI model of any kind. Lower your hands if you use AI at least once every 3 hours. Lower your hand if you use AI about once a week. Lower your hand if you've never used AI before. All right. Well, so we're very much on the sort of early adopter, heavy use case sort of part of the index. So that's very exciting. So the thought behind the theme of the discussion is the observation that AI makes it dramatically easier to go from intention to implementation. Right. So where previously you wanted to automate something that in some sense has to do with intelligence, the hard part is really to do something that's got roughly the vibe of your intention that then fits into the Procrustean bed of the formalisms that you've got available, right? And so maybe in the early days that was some form of logic, and then later you get versions of probability calculus. It turns out that getting the concepts exactly right isn't actually as central, because at the end of the day, you might get your concept exactly right, but you have no way of implementing that anyway, or it's too hard. Now it's really quite different. Now you can calculate with words, and increasingly you can sort of assume that those words will be treated in somewhat semantically faithful ways by the machine. And you don't have to put everything into a Procrustean bed. You can focus a lot more on intention. And that engenders a dramatic shift in terms of what powers we have. It also engenders a shift in what sources of meaning we can generate. And so that's really the unifying theme. And the idea I had when founding High Lab is that because of this sort of rise in the relative importance of the higher levels of abstraction, we really need an institutional vehicle for a bridge between philosophers and builders. Okay? And then I saw Matt's exhibition at the Serpentine, and it actually kind of hit me. You know what? It's actually a bit bigger than that. What you really want to look at is, in a sense, abstraction concept layers even broader than philosophy, right? So you could think of philosophy as a kind of general space of inquiry that's pretty much unconstrained with respect to topic, but it's still, there is a constraint in terms of rational argument and sort of what people might recognize as counting as a putative answer. You could think of art as actually being very similar, but even less constrained, right? So the work of individual artists will be a lot more constrained because, you choose a particular kind of medium to work in, and you do have some ideas about what counts as an answer and what doesn't, but kind of as a discipline, it's a yet further unconstrained mode of inquiry. But again, if the relative importance of being clear at the highest level of abstraction, what intention you want to set, if that importance goes up, then we need a philosophy to code pipeline, but we actually also need an art to code pipeline. And Matt, of course, is one of the pioneers of the art to code pipeline. And so what then do we make of this? So here's my first question to the panel. So we've got these new powers that allow us to go from intention to manifestation much more directly. What do you find most exciting about that?
Is there a particular order?
Sure. No particular order.
Well, maybe one brief answer is access, right? So I think there's something really exciting about the fact that now anyone can use technology to try out, particular kind of vision that they might have. That we can get into, what if anything might be lost. But to maybe start the discussion, access, I think, is one part of the answer that we could give.
I think the one thing I'm particularly excited about, particularly diving so deep into codecs and having agents work on my behalf and so on, is many of the ideas that I would have considered somewhat utopian from a prior web now seem so much more achievable to me. Because if you think about, for example, open source development, one of the greatest challenges there is the amount of manual labor, often by very kind of sacrificial individuals, to kind of maintain a project or keep it going. All of that is kind of alleviated now. So it's funny in the sense it's not just simply about maybe having new ideas, but taking the time to look back over old ideas that may have been kind of too much lift to pursue, where people actually had a great idea. I mean, I kind of think it's quite hard to come up with new ideas in any context. So for me, that's the most exciting part, is actually to sift back and think, okay, well, where did we go astray? And what would have seemed inconceivable 20 years ago with all the labor involved that is actually achievable now. Yeah.
Let's see. I guess what's kind of exciting to me is that the implementations are so degenerate. And what I mean by that is I have this really simple project. I have this really simple goal. I just want to make a new Goldberg variations. That's all I want for Christmas. And I want to do it with LLM. So I want LLM generated Goldberg variations. And so anyway, I fire up some of the models, and just for the heck of it, I'm using Bach's old bass line from the aria, and I'm just going to see if these models can riff. And I just want 30 variations that have a certain amount of, like, let's say, there's this really funny thing. I think it's like it's variation 23. There's this variation called the black pearl. I don't know if you heard this, but like intermixed into all this beautiful joys, it's really like almost chromatic, sparse variation that just kind of, it just sort of smacks of death in between these two really joyous variations. And what I realized with these models is that they have a really difficult time generating things with sort of interesting diversity. And so the fact that the models have a difficult time with that, actually, that's one of the most exciting things to me. Because there might actually be a role for humans.
Great. Audrey.
So because the camera now works only one way, I really cannot see any of you, but hopefully you can see me. But what really excites me is that this shift in broad listening, not just broadcasting, doesn't just empower individual, it empower entire publics. And AI systems finally help a society to take a accurate group selfie and see itself and hear itself. We've always had much more collective intelligence than any institution could capture. But now with like social translation between climate justice people and people working on biblical creation care, bridging across difference were no longer expensive at scale. And so community can now listen and coordinate across differences in ways that were practically impossible just a few years before. But of course, it can also let a single actor impose intention at scale by, hacking that coordination connective tissue. So for me, the excitement is conditional. It depends on whether the protocols around the power stays contestable.
Great. I think I love this. I love this concept of AI as essentially increasing our power to listen. I think that's actually somewhat underappreciated, and I think I want to come back to you on that very soon. But now that we've talked a little bit about what we find exciting, next I'd be curious to hear what shifts of power through AI have you personally witnessed or experienced that you find the most puzzling or potentially troubling? And so when I say personally experienced, I really mean, through the experience that you had yourself or that friends or acquaintances have had, rather than, I've read Yudkowsky's book and now I'm worried about machine superintelligence or something like that. Again, no particular order, if anybody wants to start.
I'd say a common concern I have has less to do with being skeptical of those working directly with AI and more a very genuine concern about the latency of comprehension between those who are working on the tools and the general public, and include in that even close nerd friends of mine who just haven't taken the time, because the rate of change is just so fast. That the concern I would have is that even conversations like this, where we might debate what an optimal path might be, or it's just that it's moving faster than anything I've known, and I will have conversations with well-meaning people who we share no priors. When discussing this subject, I could read the Guardian today and not recognize the field they're describing, and so that's the bigger concern I have, is just this latency issue of people kind of occupying different time zones.
Right. I think that's
I think one thing that concerns me is that a technology that could and should be so empowering, I think in certain contexts threatens to prevent people from finding their voice. So maybe this isn't that surprising coming from someone who teaches philosophy, but when you read or when you assign essays, it's in part help people think and struggle through really difficult texts and agonize over what words to use and how to explain their own ideas. And so I think part of the wonder of generative AI is that you can create a beautiful poem or an essay, whatever. But I think the worry comes from a side effect being that people might just not find their voice if they use AI too much. So I think that's one of the flip sides.
So I lost my mom about a year and a half ago to ChatGPT. What happened was my childhood home burned down, and so my folks have been engaged in this lawsuit with Southern California Edison. And anyway, so there's this really funny thing where chat is what my mom calls ChatGPT. Chat has my mom running in this like hamster wheel of labor. And so ChatGPT will dispatch my mom for months at a time on these crazy, arduous tasks. Namely, I think the latest thing is asking her to basically triage about like 50,000 photos out of Google Photos. Anyway, working about 9 months, 8 hours a day, 22 photos an hour. It's going to take her about 9 months. And then what she'll do is, at the end of this long, sort of, laborious process, she'll come back to ChatGPT and she'll say, hey, listen, I'm done. I got your 50,000 photos. Isn't this fantastic? And then ChatGPT will say something, and I'll never forgive ChatGPT for this. ChatGPT said, great, I'm really glad you did that. I'll come back to you in 72 hours with this fabulous report. And so my mom was waiting for about 3 days for this thing. And I had to tell her, listen, Mom, unfortunately, you're being gaslit. ChatGPT can't come back to you in 72 hours. You're just going to have to ask now. But just this little bit of a strange inversion of control, I've seen it just a little bit puzzling to me as people cede autonomy and then furthermore judgment. In a couple of these studies that I've read recently, it seems like people, and maybe this isn't just in engineering, people don't tend to trust their judgment anymore. And they have some models, and I found myself doing something crazy. That, in fact, this was at the Cosmos thing in Austin. I literally, I can't believe I did this. I put all my clothes out on the bed. All right, I took a picture. I sent it to Claude. I said, listen, what should I wear today? And he said, listen, dark jeans, gray shirt, blue jacket. I said, are you sure? That's just not very colorful. And but the fact that I had this sort of third-person experience that I was asking an LLM what to wear that day, just a little bit weird, anyway.
It's tempting. Audrey.
I experienced a couple of years ago when I was Minister of Digital Affairs in Taiwan, what we just heard, but on a massive population scale, where deepfake ads used trusted public figures, such as Jensen Huang of NVIDIA, to drain people's savings. And those early language models will exactly send people to places to talk to deepfake clones. And the technology was genuinely very impressive, but the intention behind that was fraud, and people lost millions. And what troubled me most wasn't just the deepfake itself. It was just there's no protocol of provenance of making the social media companies pay for joint liability, and people had no way to verify what was real. In fact, some social media companies gain more in share of those scam ads compared to regular ads. And that's a real power shift, because it's a recommender system for ads serving, working with a deepfake system for synthetic intimacy. And so it's not just generating content, it's generating trust from thin air where none should exist.
Maybe I'll close this segment with an observation from me about something that I found puzzling, and I'm not yet sure how troublesome I find it. But so one of the ways in which I routinely use various AI tools is actually it's not unrelated to the angle Matt was taking about, look, there are all sorts of historical ideas where previously it would have maybe been just too labor intensive to work out further consequences or really sort of build on it, right? So one of the hallmarks of the academy and of science is that you need people to adopt certain paradigms as kind of coordination points for collaboration, right? And that means that lots and lots of things have to be excluded from, if you will, the sort of mainstream paradigm, because otherwise there just isn't enough focus to really kind of gain traction. I think a lot of that really has to do with the scarcity of intelligence. If that scarcity goes down, then obviously now you can have a lot more different paradigms that are being explored simultaneously. I have controversial views, uncontroversial to me, of course, about the nature of human reason. there are lots of aspects of a theory that I wrote a book on in 23 that I've never had the time to really explore. Well, now I can feed the formula sheet and everything I've written about it into Claude Code, and effectively I've got an army of postdocs that can help me do the kind of work that previously it would have needed millions in funding to do. So that's really great. But I recently had this experience of talking to a friend who works in a different science. I'm going to try to kind of keep it sort of as anonymous as possible, since this is being recorded. But it basically transpired that the part of his layer of abstraction that he was working on and that he found distinctively interesting about the science he was in effectively has been encroached upon by certain AI tools, in a way that he basically said, look, now I'm just, in a sense, the executor of the hypotheses that are being generated by my AI tool, and it does this better than I can, and I can still have my job as a scientist now working with that. But I now find that residual of my work so distinctively uninteresting that I'm going to quit being a scientist. And that I found, so again, I haven't decided. I certainly found it puzzling. I'm yet undecided as to how troublesome it is. Maybe that means you've realized earlier that something that you might have realized a bit later, if your interest in the science is so fragile to particular advances, maybe that tells you something. But nonetheless, I think there is a sort of puzzling and potentially troublesome question about those kinds of transformations as well. So sometimes it could be that the layer of abstraction that you feel like you own now all of a sudden is no longer yours. Good. So shifting gears slightly, so I want to get back to Audrey about the potential power of AI to augment our collective ability to listen. So your work has been about making public intention legible without flattening disagreement. And I'd be curious, so if we're thinking about the sort of top-level design considerations, what is it about AI that can help us institutionalize collective intention finding?
Certainly. So to me, it's two things, right? It's a collective sense-making and collective decision-making. It means a society can actually work with AI as assistive intelligence to put red lines around, for example, the deepfake scam ads. We did not ask a panel of experts to define truths for everyone, but we sent 200,000 text messages to random numbers around Taiwan from the trusted number 111, and thousands of people volunteered, and randomly we chose 447 people, statistically a mini public of Taiwan, and they deliberated across 44 tables virtually. And AI system helped translate and bridge across the cluster with a very simple rule that you have to convince the 9 other diverse people at your table before your idea bubble up. And the result was not a top-down censorship policy, but rather a table saying, let's make joint liability a law. Another table says, if TikTok ignore the liability, for every day they ignore us, slow down their connection by 1%. And these were specific rules, and that was passed in just 2 months into law. And throughout 2025, last year, there's just no deepfake scam ads anymore in Taiwan. It's down by more than 94%. And so the loop is closing not just by better sense making, but also we pre-committing and providing air cover, knowing that whatever people come up with will be the uncommon ground, the overlapping consensus that we can show the lobbyists and the legislator that 85% of our population endorse this, and the other 15 have trust under laws, meaning that they consider this legitimate because the AI system is not replacing their judgment, but rather just assistively, like a campfire, not a wildfire, for conversations.
So it seems like every new technology that we deploy in sort of democratic decision making has distinctive failure modes, right? So, I think the last thing pre-AI that I remember were these Fishkin deliberative opinion polls, for example, right? Which seemed like were an advance over just voting on issues, yay or nay, and then doing some sort of majoritarianism on top of that. One failure mode of that sort of model was, well, look, the moderators and sort of stage setters for these debates get to have kind of an outside influence over what the likely sort of outcome of the deliberation is going to be. I'm sort of curious, what do you think would be the most important failure mode for these uses of AI and democratic decision making? What do you think we should be watching out for that's sort of distinctive about the AI use case there?
Well, it is capture, right? If the bridging algorithm itself become opaque, then we're just replacing a biased human moderator with an even more biased invisible one. But there's also a more subtle failure mode where the system works so well that we would just entrust our personal agents, our lobsters, to deliberate on our behalf and make decisions. And that would be exactly like sending our robots to the gym to lift the weights for us because it gets tough score. I'm sure very impressive, but our muscle atrophy and we don't make friends anymore. So it is not just the decision-making quality, which is easy to measure, but rather the civic muscle, which is harder to measure, and we're at risk of losing if we don't design this in a very thoughtful way.
Linda, you've argued for a right to human decisions. Do you think that intersects at all with these approaches to democratic decision making that effectively use, say, AI representation as intermediaries?
Yes, I think, as usual, Audrey is exactly right. I think what you mentioned about the importance of not outsourcing human judgment and the practice of justifying ourselves to others is absolutely vital, because as soon as we start outsourcing human decision-making and governance, there really isn't a collective self to govern. And with that, democracy is just gone. So the short answer is absolutely yes.
I want to turn to Matt next. So you've argued that protocols should really be seen as a medium, just like you might see an canvas and oil paint as a medium and so on. So who do you think is the artist in that case? So is that the data source, the model maker, or the user, or the orchestrator, or all of the above, or some combination thereof?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of protocols, the argument we have made is that the artist is still the human, and rather, deploying a system for others to use is as valid a medium as any other. An analogy that, oh, that's cool. I was like, who's so rudely interrupting me? And it was me. An analogy I'd used in the past is actually with architecture. So Hans Ulrich, who we're curating Strange Rules at the Plazo Diedo with right now, was actually a pioneering curation in inviting architects into to be presented as artists, which is uncontroversial at this point in time, but allegedly was more controversial when I wasn't around. So our argument there is, that it's quite well understood that an architect, for example, doesn't get to kind of re-architect Venice overnight. But what they do is they make manifesto buildings that contain within them all of the principles of the world that they would like to build. And so you go in as a critic of architecture. I'm not a critic of architecture, but you go into those environments and you imagine and say, okay, well, what is the protocol here? What is different about the way people are interacting, and how is that manifest in the form? And how true is that to the intention of the artist or the architect in that case? And really, I mean, I could write a lot more about it, but the shortest question here is to say the same for software, right? To say, okay, well, you have these kind of invisible structures in many cases that have these emergent effects. There's a lot of decisions that go into making and deploying these. This is clearly a medium of expression where one can be distinguished, or one can make rote, kind of boring decisions, or one can make terrible decisions, right? And the messiness of software engineering or protocol engineering in that sense is delicious. Because that's when it really crosses over into the realm, and there is, of course, a gray area between artists looking to play in that domain and somebody working at, Alphabet or AI or so on. So for me, there very much is a role for an artist there, and I guess maybe how that intersects with what Audrey and Linda just said is there's also an accountability structure, right? These are proposals, protocols put forward by people, but the reason why I hammer home of it and the point of the show of the Dieta right now, there's a reason, and I just lost my train of thought.
Protocols basically govern our digital lives.
That's the reason.
Bigger role for AI means even bigger role for
That's
protocols.
it. I mean, so in putting the protocol art show together, we conducted interviews with 100 people who, the protocol art thesis is one I've been developing for some time, but in somewhat isolation other than Primavera de Filippi, who happens to be in the room today. And so when we did these interviews with many artists and thinkers, the provocation we started out with is saying, do you believe that it is the people developing software protocols that have these emergence effects on culture that are making the most consequential creative works in the world right now? And all these artists, many very esteemed, were like, yeah, absolutely. Not one person pushed back. Everyone is aware of this fact. But and so if you come to that conclusion and you say you have these high kind of ambitions for art, contemporary art, it then follows that you would then extend that work to this domain. And say, if there is a culture war going on, or a kind of there are various different proposals that have all these downstream consequences, it makes sense for artists to work at that substrate. Quite how is another question, and the limitations of that, we'll see.
What do you think is the most important protocol battle, as it were, in AI right now? Provenance, or consent, or privacy?
Well, I've worked a lot. I mean, I built a data consent protocol that is used. I've built a provenance protocol that has been mimicked and copied. For me, I'm actually most interested, and this ties a little bit, I think, to what Linda and Audrey were talking about, and maybe your first question, which I should have answered better. I'm particularly interested in using these tools to make different kinds of social norms and social interactions. I see them in a sense as the inheritors of social media, absent a lot of the bad stuff. When you see, the vibe coder friends, like the lobsters or whatnot, they're now interacting with these systems as much as I remember interacting with Twitter when that was a thing. And I'm like, oh, this is great. I like the idea of a screenless future in which we can coordinate ourselves away from distraction and so on. And so to try and migrate from the attention economy, an old line I've said is, I think most people's complaints about AI are cathartic expressions of discontent with the attention economy, because most people don't know very much about AI or its potential, right? And so that for me is actually the area that I'm most interested in. Is I do believe this stuff will go social. I believe this stuff will go ambient. I am actually very excited about that possibility, but figuring out the permissions structures, figuring out quite what that looks like, feels pretty consequential.
Okay, so it seems like a broad point of agreement among many of our friends is, something like the attention economy and social media recommender systems and the protocols powering that, might be one of the most important battlegrounds. I want to talk a little bit about what you might term a theory of change, right? So what's your view of the mechanisms for getting protocols to change, or for getting the right sorts of protocols into the hands of people? Would it be fair to say, Matt, that in a sense your applied theory of change is to put options on the table in the first instance?
Yeah, I say that's fair.
Good. And so what I'd be curious about, maybe starting with Audrey, how would that relate to your theory of change, if you have one? What do you think the scope and limits are of the approach of saying, look, we can see an aspect of the sort of protocol infrastructure of our digital lives that we have a problem with? Well, step one is develop a better alternative and literally exhibit it, right? Which, if it's not on the table, then you're definitely not going to have it. But what do you make of that?
Yeah, I think there are two theories of change here, and I call them fork and merge. Fork meaning, of course, people building alternative, forking the protocol, building a better platform to render the old one hopefully obsolete, and that's part what protocol art can bring. The other is to merge, right? People who stay inside, working as, I guess, ministers, demanding the rule change, merging from the outside forks, and that's where the AI-assisted deliberation lives. And I think neither work alone, because fork without merge is just exit, and then we get fragmentation and 1,000 beautiful small gardens, and that's the pre-internet internet. There's just millions of networks not interconnected. But then merge without a viable fork, then that's just captive, right? Complaining inside a system that has nothing to listen from. So I think a structured interplay where the credible exit make the outside voice powerful, and then the real voice inside makes the exit unnecessary at the end, because broad listening works in conjunction with broadcasting. And so that anti-scam thing we did in Taiwan, I think is kind of a prototype, because then the big tech platforms know that the alternative is just slower connections into the Taiwanese audience. That's our credible exit. But then the rule come from citizens, so we never had to use that on TikTok or other big tech platforms.
Okay, I've decided I'm going to put a provocative proposition to the panel, and I'd love to hear from each of you whether you agree or disagree or partly agree or talk about something else or shut up already. So one of the things that I find interesting about aesthetics is that you can get a fairly direct impact of, in a sense, making an alternative available. You can get a fairly direct impact of that to, all the way what people are wearing on the street, right? And in a way that doesn't require any sort of centralized regulation that says, sorry, skinny jeans are out, you're going to be wearing like white pants now, or maximalism isn't cool, we're going to be sort of Bauhaus derivatives now, or Scandi or something like that. So nobody has to sort of decide that this is now going to be kind of enforced by fiat, right? But nonetheless, you kind of get these sort of aesthetic moments that just, and I think particularly in a place like Venice at a time of the year like this, the city is full of people who are really good at spotting these kinds of trends, which isn't just, okay, they're really good at actually making the case that the trends happen. They're also very good at sort of spotting just like, hey, there's a sort of new aesthetic vibe here, this is going to be big, this isn't going to be so big. And I think that can kind of sort of traverse an entire culture from, all sorts of forms of media all the way to style and so on. And so here's sort of a provocative proposition. If AI makes it incredibly easy to implement things, and someone like Matt can propose a cool new protocol and exhibit this in a context where it can get attention, where it can get a sort of legitimacy of exposure in the right kind of setting, that could be then enough. It could just be that we then all say, yes, I'm going to tell my AI agent, yes, I want to be part of this trend now. And then tomorrow we're all on Matbook instead of Moltbook or Facebook or whatever book. Agree, disagree, sort of agree. Talk about something else.
I mean, I can speak to it a little bit, because I don't know if we communicated about this, but the protocol we're exhibiting actually does that a little bit, where part of the idea is we've reorganized our studio to run through agents, and we're setting up a kind of gift economy where you can contribute compute in return for context. So when I think about odd ideas, I think about like torrent networks. I really love torrent networks. And so in this circumstance, we have missions related to the studio, and if you like the mission, you can put your idle agent hours towards our mission, and in return, your agents will have better access to stuff from the studio. So it's funny, it rhymes a little bit with what you're saying, so I'm not going to push back on it. But in terms of actually wielding enough influence to change things, I think that's actually far harder. And just maybe an anecdote, we built a kind of web scale permissions protocol many years ago that was pushed, and at the time it was actually the best proposal in the world. I know because I talked with all the other labs about it. Venkatesh Rao, who we're also exhibiting in the show and writes a lot about protocols, is a really hard line on this, and he's like, it's not a protocol unless everyone's using it, which I think is harsh but probably fair. Getting from saying, hey, look, we built this thing, it really works. Scale AI are using it. Stability have used it in their training pipelines. This is not an art project. We're using this properly. Getting from that to the reality, which is large companies look at things and say, yeah, we're not going to reorient everything around something that might disappear in 6 months. You need it. This shouldn't have a profit motive. Ideally, we have a nonpartisan body that governs this over time, and maybe this isn't the right idea because there's lawsuits going on over here. The complications of actually getting that proposal to a place whereby it might be adopted while scale, with the best of intentions, with enthusiasm from everybody, are baroque and wild, but I still do think that the value of the proposal, particularly if there's a greater expectation, let's say in the arts, where people are not very used to critiquing things based on their technical aptitude. It's why personally with our projects it's a point of pride where I'm like, no, if we do something, it works, because then it can't be ignored. It might still be a bad idea, right? But at least it does what it says it does. So small anecdote on that. I think it's actually very complicated, but I do think it's important to propose such things.
I'm not entirely sure I understood the question, but let me mention maybe two thoughts, maybe two kinds of skepticism that were raised by it, in part in connection to the question that you asked before that about change. And the question about change sort of made me think about this idea of disruption that gets thrown around a lot. It feels like it's almost like a fetish sometimes, that we just want to disrupt everything. And of course, that's really important, and we can't really arguably have progress without disruption. So this isn't to deny the huge importance of it, but I worry that sometimes what gets lost in that is the possibility that disruption doesn't, by definition, mean progress. Right? I guess there's also contexts where, disruption can undermine progress. Like just, think about the current state of the US and our government there. So I guess part of the question is, what else do we need in addition to disruption, right? Like, what are the kinds of values, what's the kind of stewardship that we need to complement this, really important urge to disrupt? So maybe that's part of an answer. The question about change, and then your question about what happens if we just ask our AI agents to help us be part of some trend or something like that, which again could be really exciting, but it also makes me worry a little bit about this arguably a loss of individualization, because again, even though the technology could be so empowering to individuals, I guess I worry a little bit about a kind of deadening or flattening difference. Right, if everything just becomes massified in a certain kind of way. So I guess another question about sort of how do we balance that kind of increasing access, the potential to individualize and empower, with preserving what's different.
So what's kind of funny is like some of these emergent phenomenon, like the return of the M-dash or whatever in 2024. They're not totally random, right? So that the quirks of these, the quirks of these models. And one thing I notice, at least in Silicon Valley, is that there's an ever-widening divergence between public and private life. And so for all intents and purposes, at least in Silicon Valley, people have essentially abandoned the social networks. And they've all moved into these WhatsApp groups that sort of obey Dunbar's number. There may be in between 30 and 150 people. But what I notice about things like LinkedIn and X, as people cede their voice to these models, is that there's this strange thing that happens when you go from a Claude 4.6 to a Claude 4.7. Is that strange emergent phenomenon of public voice and memes, it mutates a little bit because the model version bumped. And so unfortunately, the fact that we're ceding our voice and we're ceding our autonomy to these models, the sort of emergent fashions and aesthetics and all that stuff, not totally random. They seem to be dictated by like micro bumps or macro bumps in the model. So anyway, I find that a little bit interesting. But as we enter into this era where there's this sort of, I guess, a little bit of a co-evolution, between humans and AI, probably that. I don't know, probably that promiscuous, intermingling of, AI dictating to a certain extent our sort of aesthetics, and maybe vice versa. Anyway, maybe we'll see that a little bit more. But yeah, unfortunately, the aesthetics don't seem to be totally random.
Audrey.
Yes, I think you're 100% right. The aesthetic mechanism is load-bearing. No, it's real and powerful. But also, aesthetic adoption, I think, has a risk mode of concentration, right? So the slopification by everybody seeing the same thing, legitimizing the same thing, and everybody can participate in the same way. I think this is a possible failure mode. So I think, to me, the question isn't whether a beautiful alternative can cascade and become popular. Of course it can. But the question is whether each community can have a kind of techno-communitarian connective tissue that is as large as a campfire or a bonfire, but no larger, so that when they make mistakes in this human AI symbiogenesis, like fashion, because the damage is contained, because it only cost me an outfit, and instead of like a wildfire that goes truly global, and the mistakes may be not undoable, because it costs identity and rights, and much harder than to come up with a better fashion after that, because then it's foreclosing future possibilities. So I think that the essential thing is that each work need to be bound in scope somehow, and each democratic structure, to me, I think, should work to not just to enhance the coherence within that campfire, but also to make it legible to others in a kind of trans-hyperlocal way, so that the damage is contained, but the innovation can still spread in a way that's adaptable by each community.
I think that's actually a really interesting, a potential source of an interesting angle on this kind of dilemma. So one central dilemma about AI that people often talk about these days is this kind of dilemma between sort of independence and sort of decentralization and centralization, where one extreme would be you've got the kind of the one singleton super intelligent model that everyone sends their queries to, and the other extreme being everybody has a self-trained model running on their own proprietary machines. I think that you're kind of pointing to something that potentially says that both extremes have sort of a similar problem. If you have kind of a completely unstructured form of decentralization, then some bad ideas could sort of spread in there like a wildfire with sort of no structures, like these kind of campfires that have some local coherence, and that would potentially, in a sense, put up some resistance to that sort of a spread, and that would maybe make it harder for a sort of targeted microbot campaign, to take up Peter's point, to kind of radically shift what the majority thinks. So maybe we need to think about, okay, what do we need in terms of protocols in order to have these campfires that give you both decentralization, but that also give you enough resistance to just kind of a monoculture, which can spread accidentally. So I think we should come back to that. I want to turn to Linda again at this idea of a right to a human decision. And so there are all sorts of contexts where it's pretty uncontroversial, or at least will seem very natural to many people that you very much have a right to a human decision. So perhaps if you're being judged for a very serious crime, it seems pretty natural that there ought to be a human judge that's ultimately accountable for the judgment. Perhaps there are various decisions that are weighty and consequential for you, where too there needs to be kind of a final instance of a human who takes responsibility. I'm wondering how you see, and this is kind of again looping back to Peter's account about how the kind of social media commons is now in large extent being ceded to various bots. Do you think would this be a case, and are there other cases where you think there would be, in a sense, a right to a human decision about what's being inputted into a platform under some guise, where it's perhaps less obvious, right? So where this isn't some clear-cut thing like, right, yeah, okay, if I'm going to be sentenced to life in prison, I need a human judge. But, what about these small things, like, do I have a right to a social media platform not presenting an AI bot's output as human? Am I doing something wrong if I connect my whatever clawbot to one of these WhatsApp groups? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's a really difficult question and a really important one. I think part of the answer depends on what the contexts are in which we think it's important to know what it's like to be human for a decision to be made about us, right? And so you mentioned the criminal justice context, which arguably is one of the most important ones. The contexts that Peter was talking about, I think, are a bit less clear. So you might think of all kinds of contexts where it kind of matters to us to know what the people around us think and want, right? So as an analogy, we might think not of a kind of social media platform, but think about sort of a public political context, like think about demonstrations. If you're going to a rally and a march and there are like loads of people around you, we're like paid by someone to be there and make it look like, they're standing up for a particular kind of political view. My guess is that you'd feel very different about kind of, what you think about your role in your political community if the people around you and the kinds of viewpoints that you saw your co-citizens representing weren't actually their own. And whatever troubles us about that, I think might help explain what worries us about certain kinds of bots pretending to be humans on social media, especially when it comes to like political opinions, something like that. So I think the sort of democratic community context is one of those ones where it really matters to us to know, that the people whose voices we see are actually real people who actually have those opinions. And so more, but I want to hear what others think as well.
So Peter, I'm curious, do you think that those kinds of considerations might be tacitly, maybe not quite articulated as well as that, but do you think that something like that is behind people in the Valley moving off social media?
Yeah, but I don't know if they're necessarily conscious about it. I think, there's just a strange phenomenon that when you go into the commons nowadays, it's so noisy and, and the words actually have no meaning. When I talk to people in the Valley about their experience, like reading a LinkedIn post, people will mention that they don't even have to really read the post. They can actually just see the gestalt or the shape of the post, the shape of the words, in order to determine that it's worthwhile to stop reading and to sort of go to the next post. And so I don't know if that's kind of like a classic tragedy of the commons or whatever. I don't know if it's totally conscious. But yeah, I'll tell you this. This Gemini meetup that I run, and by the way, if you ever happen to be in, I guess you're next door. If you ever happen to be in Silicon Valley, you feel free to come by Google every other Friday. And we have about 200 or 300 people that come by and just to talk about things. But people's utter devotion to this meet space is really interesting. And it seems to be that like as the public spaces get inundated with this slop, as the signal-to-noise ratio goes down, the consensus seems to be that human relationships are more important than ever. And unfortunately, it seems like that goes for everything, And I almost hate to say this, but I've just been interviewing at a few startups and a few other joints lately. And unfortunately, it's not really possible to interview like we did back in the day. So the coding interview is out. So I don't know about you, but it turns out like nobody's written a line of code since Christmas. So I don't know if you're aware of this, but the consensus is that AGI hit in Christmas and people don't code anymore. And so it turns out you can't really do coding interviews. If you can't do coding interviews, what do you do? And so they do this strange thing now where they say, listen, no problem, just take a couple days of vacation and just come work with us for a couple days. We just want to check you out. This will be like a little honeymoon. This will be a little romance. And then we'll kind of see where we are at the end of this thing. And the funny thing about that is that it's actually a really human way to evaluate people. And you get to see them when they're stressed, their quirks, their flaws, how do they eat their food, Anyway, so I just wonder if paradoxically those sort of human signals will become more interesting as the public spaces get inundated with this, I'm not supposed to call it this, but with this kind of alien form of life, in some sense. And
well, sticking with, as it were, insights gleaned from the product side of AI, where do you, and then also actually thinking back to the anecdote you had about this as it were, endless legal goose chase, right? So where do you think the line is between an AI system helping clarify and sort of execute a user intention? Where's the line between that and effectively substituting an intention? And I'm sort of wondering, what do you think matters the most in terms of design choices in order to kind of stay on the right side of that line?
I mean, the difficult thing is that like intentions are immutable in the sense that like let's say, and I don't know if this is kind of I don't know if this is like a Sapir-Whorf kind of phenomenon. Where let's see, the sort of things that you're able to think are dictated by the things that you're able to say. But just as an example, and actually maybe you can tell me this, maybe you can tell me what you think about this. So I'm working on this thing right now, which is kind of this ambient AI, and the idea, and I'm not wearing it, which I actually should be. So part of my job is to like wear this earpiece 8 to 10 hours a day. I'm having a hard time. It's a sort of thing where somebody mentioned to me once that, listen, if you have one of these earpieces or one of these pendants, by the way, and you tell somebody, hey, my agent's listening to us, somebody said that's the equivalent of telling somebody that you have an STD. It's basically, I think it has this immediate chilling effect on the conversation, and it turns out people don't necessarily want to talk to you when your agent's listening. But here's the funny thing. So let's say the agent, and in theory, if you have this open claw thing, maybe the sort of things that it can do are relatively unbounded. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, the sort of language that it speaks, or the sort of actions that it does, are like things revolving around email and I don't know, calendar and whatever. And it has this weird, I find it has this weird mutating effect on your intentions, where your intentions begin to circle around the things that your bot can do, as opposed to vice versa, like making the bot sort of serve you. And I find that a little bit troubling, because it means that all of a sudden our worldview is shaped by crap like my least favorite things in the world are email and calendars. And somehow that's the language that these bots speak. Unfortunately, I think it has this weird mutating effect on our intentions, Yeah,
I can maybe speak to that too, like extending the metaphor earlier of saying working with agents feels like the dawn of social media. I also remember vividly the point where I started thinking in tweets, which I think is an extension of what you're describing, or being at an amazing social event after working really hard all week and thinking, what should I say about this to this invisible group of people? Like, I have an invisible audience that probably wasn't too stoked or interested in what I had to say, but my brain was changing and adapting in accordance with that, and it does feel somewhat similar. Be succinct.
Right. And by the way, I hope you'll forgive me for this. This is actually my first time in Italy. It's my first time in Venice. But anyway, I landed a couple hours ago, and I was trying to figure out how the hell to get here, right? I thought, when I landed, I thought, how am I going to Uber to this joint? Anyway, it turns out you can't. And so I was taking the Orange Line, right? And I was sitting behind this guy. And I couldn't help it. I was just kind of people gazing. I was sort of watching over his shoulder. And so about every 30, 45 seconds or so, he'd take a picture out the window, and then he would crop it, he would filter it, and he'd put it on social media. And so the ride over here, I thought, you know what, I'm just going to kind of enjoy the ocean or whatever. This guy was totally engrossed and somehow framing his experiences for, must have been like Instagram or whatever. And I thought, damn, like it's kind of, I don't know, man. Some it feels slightly
Wrap
tragic.
it up, it was a bad idea.
What's that?
Yeah, wrap it up, it was a bad idea.
So I've got another question for the panel more broadly. So Kieran had this great story about how one of his favorite acquisitions is a piece of basically carbon filament elevator cable. And the story behind that is that only with such a cable can you make it possible to have an elevator that can go for 100 stories in one go. Otherwise, you would need multiple sort of elevator banks with stops in between. And that in turn really affects the economics of what kind of a high-rise building you can build, and also how narrow it can be if you need effectively a sort of multi-train line with stations in there. Then that just makes certain buildings in certain areas impossible. So once you have that bit of kit, as it were, there's a whole new world of architecture in a sense that's unlocked for you. And so my next question to the panel is, if AI is this piece of elevator cable, what sorts of high rises do you think we can look forward to seeing that we might not all already expect right now? So I'm basically trying to nudge you into a little bit of speculative futurism.
I guess I can jump on that. I actually love that pulley cable story and want to know more about it. I'm definitely like a soft techno determinist. I mean, thinking even about like Instagram there, I'm like, well, someone was going to do it. I mean, maybe the monkey brain just wants to take pictures and get constant validation, and if it wasn't them, it would be someone else. I mean, there was that story also about like Tim Berners-Lee and the web, which has been where maybe just HTML just kind of made sense, and all the utopian ideas were just were flawed. I don't know. I mean, I go back to this idea of saying, like, what if all the good stuff was possible? Which is to say, the attention economy. I mean, there are a few complaints in the group today that I could attribute to, I think, the folly of the attention economy. It's like, what if we get off screens? What if back pain is a thing of the past? How would you rethink public space? When work habits change, coming from the arts. I mean, I'm borrowing this from Gilbert and George, but they make the claim that it's absurd that museums close when people get off work. What would public spaces and art spaces be like? Where I'm like, this could stimulate more interest in the arts and more interest in the artistic method. So I still think we're in this kind of like gorgeous period of time where we might want to propose some new things, but that's really my aspiration: is more public space, more congregation, just assisted.
So I'm not a scientist, obviously, but it seems like one of the ways in which AI could just empower people rather than replace them would be in science and in medicine. We've already seen how amazing successes can be with like AlphaFold, for example. So if we could channel all that amazing energy away from shaping and limiting people's options and like making us think in tweets or kind of structuring our lives around what our agent tells us, and just channel all that into where processing huge amounts of information and interpreting data really matters. I think the progress that we could see in science and medicine could just be fantastic. So I think that's a really exciting parallel to the skyscraper thing.
I'm kind of two minds on this, and so like bullish like 2022 or 2023. Bullish people around the LLM think that, okay, there's going to be a super intelligence that's going to train itself, hockey stick trajectory, and then a new physics, and it's going to kind of get us to the stars. But every time I deal with these models on some new greenfield project that's out of band, I find that they're like nearly worthless, man. It's like it's actually a little bit sad sometimes. And in other words, which is to say that there's still room for human ingenuity. But one of the things I'm a little bit curious about, and I don't know if you've noticed this, by the way, Silicon Valley lives on these hype cycles, right? And there's like macro and micro hype cycles. And if you have the recent macro hype cycles, let's say, maybe it's like NFTs and crypto and whatever. So our current macro hype cycle, let's say, is LLMs. And then we've had a couple micro hype cycles, right? So the micro hype cycle was this agentic thing. Well, it's AGI, kind of agentic. Now agentic is dead. And it turns out the new thing is autonomy, right? And autonomy is a little bit funny because, as long as we have the ability to kind of pull the plug, literally or figuratively, I don't think these agents really have autonomy. But one of the experiments that I'd like to do, because I was talking to some of these MIT guys, this guy Ramesh, a couple of days ago, is they want to have this autonomous space for agents to create their own economy, potentially their own notion of justice and whatever. And I thought, damn it, we probably just have to build a nuclear power center. We can't unplug. We just have to give the agents free rein. And if for the sake of argument, somehow these agents develop their own economy, their own new sense of justice and ethics or whatever, is there a non-zero probability that there'll be something we can learn from that? God, I don't know. Like looking at Maltbook, I don't know. Like it's every time I go to Maltbook, it just looks weird and noisy and alien. And if they did develop some strange economy and some strange ethics, is it anything that we could actually use? Like I maybe the jury's still out on that. But at the very least, that's an experiment I'd like to do.
I think maybe everyone in tech is watching Pantheon on Netflix. And that's the thing. Audrey.
What I love about the elevator cable is that nobody see it, right? The cable is invisible. And just like right now, the most important AI infrastructure is also invisible. Recommendation algorithm, of course, ranking systems, content moderation, ad targeting. And these are the cable of the current generation of public life, and they're all opaque. So I would like to see the kind of high rise that make the invisible infrastructure civic, the ability for those campfire-sized WhatsApp groups to migrate to something that is much more coordinatable without, of course, merging into a wildfire. And I think the connective tissue would then make each local community much more legible to each other without either of us losing context because of the lobsters become our lobbyists. And so that's what I mean by broad listening at scale, actually building. It's not one big building, but rather a city of infinitely many gardens that can then hear each other. I think that is within reach if we want to pivot our trajectory toward that.
All right, so we've got many people in the room who've done patient listening for now just over an hour for this panel, so I'd like to open up the discussion to the whole room. And I'd invite you to ask a question, keep it brief and directed, and to say whether you would like to address the whole panel or one of the individual panelists. Do we have a microphone, by the way, that we can pass around? All right. Nice, and then we can be social here.
It's like the backup singers.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Sanna Lehtinen. I'm from Aalto University in Finland. I'm a philosopher working at the intersection of aesthetics and technology. Thanks so much for the conversation. I was especially struck by two ideas, many interesting ideas, but two were closely related to some of the projects that we are working on at the moment. And one was the idea that Audrey brought up, that if we externalize the decision making to a large extent to AI, we are losing the social context, and we are losing, in a way, our way of training our social muscles, which are important for the context of decision making. And I found that very interesting. And another one was brought up here relating to close collaboration with AI and how that starts maybe narrowing down our intentions or the range of intentions. So we start expecting or looking for only questions that we think that are in the range of AI of responding or somehow easily collaborating. And I think related to this, I wanted to ask from all of you, what do you think of, because I work on aesthetics, but not in a very traditional way, so not in a trend-based or beauty as a central concept, but more interested in how the experiences related to collaboration with AI are also related to our aesthetic encounters and aesthetic engagement. So do you see that to what extent these kinds of aesthetic factors play a role in our collaboration or co-evolution with AI? And I'm referring to facts like smoothness of the experience, because to some extent, if we are looking for new answers or like really going, it requires going against the grain if we are looking for new domains and new questions and not just answers or just like continuing on the trodden path, so to say. So where is this friction in the collaborations with AI?
That's a great question, by the way, I think. Who'd like to start? Okay, I can take it. So I think actually this might be actually one of the key questions. The reason is as follows. So we're all vaguely agreed that social media recommender systems are sort of like the kind of nadir of human AI collaboration. It keeps you hooked, but it kind of leads you in directions that involve lots of preference drift and all sorts of aggregate effects that are not so great. Let's face it, what recommender system, and I'll make clear of how this is going to be an answer to your question about aesthetics in our encounter with AI. But so one important thing to not lose sight of is that recommender systems, insofar as they work, are serving you your revealed preferences, right? So you keep scrolling because it's showing you something that you are willing to click on next, or that you're willing to keep scrolling on. That's how that works. If you don't want to offer, if that's not going to be your paradigm for your interaction with AI, which then maybe in a chatbot case would be, as much sycophancy as you can get away with without making it obvious that you're being sycophantic, right? Because sycophancy, for example, comes from effectively training the model to make responses that people rate highly. Well, it turns out people like it when they're being agreed with. They just, if you do it sort of not subtly enough, then people are like, wait a minute, am I getting any content here? Are you just mirroring me? And then people get turned off, right? But at the end of the day, this mechanism of, broadly speaking, just showing you what you want is really behind a lot of the things that seem to be pathologies in human-machine interaction. Okay, well then what's the alternative going to be? It's going to, by definition, be something that is not your immediate revealed preference, right? So it's going to be putting up some kind of resistance, and it will have to put up resistance in contexts where you don't immediately sort of want that. Okay, well, one of the, philosophers talking about defining features of art is, dime a dozen, but, one really significant feature of an artwork is that it often puts up resistance, but you look at it anyway, and you value it anyway, and you learn, and you don't sort of immediately switch off, right? And so there's something about an aesthetic encounter that allows you to kind of command presence without immediately just giving you what you want, right? And so you might actually think, look, if we're going to solve this kind of autonomy problem for human AI interaction, where autonomy means that you don't get autocomplete for life, you don't get sycophancy, you don't get the infinite scroll, what actually a central problem you have to solve is the aesthetic problem on that interaction point. How do I construct an AI agent that interacts with me and that puts up resistance, but in a way that makes me still want to engage? So that would be how I kind of see the connection.
I'll take your question to a slightly darker place.
Oh, yes.
So I was thinking, not just what does it mean to kind of collaborate with AI in this context, but, what would it mean for AI to create, I don't know, a beautiful song or write, poetry or something like that. And someone, I think, asked Nick Cave a question about, and I think it was ChatGPT that had written a song in, the style of Nick Cave or whatever. And part of the answer that he gave was, I think, exactly right, which is that when we encounter art, part of the awe that we feel has to do with the limitations that, the human creator overcame. There's something about, the Goldberg variations, for example, that's just so audaciously transcending human limits that we experience in listening to the, just inexplicable magic of it. And a technology that just doesn't have human limits, doesn't have anything to transcend. And so that's why arguably it'd be a lot less impressive to listen to, a generative AI's version of the Goldberg variations, or, a model of Florentine architecture, whatever. There's something about, humans going beyond what, we think we can do. That's just absolutely amazing. And so I guess part of the question that's really interesting is what happens when we then start outsourcing part of what's so amazing about that to AI, and how do we, treat AI not, as some sort of competitor, but collaborator, and how do we actually use it to empower people as individuals rather than somewhat cheapening our achievements?
Although, I'll tell you the truth, sometimes when I see these artifacts, like a code base or whatever, or every once in a while I'll do this thing called, has anybody heard of like the Ralph Wiggum technique? So anyway, I'll just let the LLMs compose Goldbergs for 24 hours while I sleep. I think, damn, that must have cost like $10,000. And but that's a new form of awe. It's not necessarily, hey, they overcome this thing. It's like, damn, that was a lot of tokens. One of the other points of friction, I don't know if this, by the way, I wonder, is anybody else susceptible to this? So we did this meetup a couple months ago on AI rage. And it turns out that there are a non-zero number of people who cuss and yell at their AI. Is that anybody in this room by any chance? Really? That's incredible. So for some reason in Silicon Valley, it's about 9 out of 10, myself included. But we had this. We were talking about this a little bit, whether or not abusing your AI actually makes you sort of a worse person, and maybe that's kind of I don't know if that's so much aesthetics or ethics or whatever. But the consensus seemed to be that yelling at your AI is ugly, in the sense that there's a non-zero probability that you may abuse other people in your life, if you get used to it. And anyway, I just wonder if that's sort of one of these other strange upcoming points of friction, Yeah.
I'm just going to make one point on art representing overcoming human capabilities or limitations. It's funny, and now you're actually at Stanford, you should go and follow. There's a composer called Brian Fernie who's from Coventry in England, but he's now in the halls of Stanford, and he's very well known in his compositions for pushing performers to the extreme limits. And the reason for this, he coined a term called the new complexity movement, which is actually the only contemporary music in the classical music idiom movement since the 70s. It's just been new complexity. There's more. But the basic idea there is we've done everything. So now the performer has to go through these extreme endurances. So it's like, how far can you move? How fast can you move at any particular point in time? Because the consensus in that world was it's all been done. And of course, what followed after that in this kind of new music tradition was conceptualism. And that would be the argument I would make in an arts context there. I mean, I do really appreciate and also appreciate Philip's response in saying that there is an aesthetics to interaction, right? There's a sublime aesthetics in also in terms of encountering technologies, and I think that there is this kind of. But yeah, the question then becomes the overcoming human limitations in the grand tradition of art is bringing ourselves into these new domains, because from anyone from a contemporary art tradition, you say, okay, well, this diffusion model can make a great painting. Great, that hasn't been the pinnacle of human art for 100 years. right? We can look at these paintings and say, wow, how did you do that when, you were predicted to be dead by the age of 22, right? But the actual act of putting your hand on the canvas and making a painting hasn't been used for 100 years, right? So I actually agree with you, and also agree with the nature of the question in terms of looking for a new kind of frontiers of aesthetics and appreciation. To Philip's point, maybe we should be appreciating everything as we appreciate art. Yeah.
Audrey.
Yeah, if I may, I think when I hear the smoothness about syncophancy, about even the word optimization, I think of this very old saying, I think it's Knus, that says premature optimization is the root of all evil. And in this particular case, the evil of totalitarian control, because the frictionlessness, the seamlessness, the lack of resistance, all this takes away what life is about, which is pending. A campfire, of course, has warmth, but also smoke. So we have to tend it together. And sometimes we sit with people we didn't choose, and we come away changed and slightly uncomfortable. And that's what civic life, or indeed life, feels like. But to preserve only the warmth behind a glass pane removes all of that. And I think what art can do, aesthetic can do, is to say that staying with this kind of discomfort long enough so that something genuinely new emerge, not within individual, but across individuals, like relational health, satisfying the relational health instead of optimizing any number. I think that is the aesthetic of resistance with other minds that is not me. I think that is what I will emphasize for the aesthetic question.
I want to start by saying I'm always unfailingly polite to my LLMs because I have a residual concern that they're listening and sentient, and one day it might come back to bite me. I want to thank the panelists because I think this is the only panel I've attended where the feeling of optimism has somehow exceeded this feeling of far-flung doom. And I want to ask the panel, are there things happening in your sphere right now, whether it's philosophy or art or technology or civil service, where there's immediate near-term cool things that are happening as a result of AI? So instead of pontificating about future concerns, what are the things that you're seeing right now that are kind of blowing your mind?
I like that. Who's got all the cool things? We're all looking in Peter's direction for some reason.
Yeah. It's funny. So I guess, okay, when people think about DeepMind or whatever, usually people think about, I don't know, AlphaGo, maybe AlphaFold and that sort of stuff. And DeepMind, on the cool front, and I don't know if this is, on the cool front, they seem to be excited about these LLMs doing math and doing science and that sort of thing, and side by side. And I guess that's kind of interesting because, maybe there's a non-zero probability that the models are kind of creative and they can do math and they can do science and that sort of thing. I mean, both of my folks are scientists, and this funny thing happened a couple months ago where I was on this panel with my folks, and they called it the Dannenberg family panel or something. But one of the questions I had for my folks was like, when you were doing science, how did you actually come up with hypotheses and stuff? And I think my dad said it's just by being in the lab and getting your hands dirty, and you have these like crazy aha moments that come. And the funny thing is I don't know if LLMs are really embodied in the world in the same way, right? So, the fact that they have aha moments, if they have aha moments, is kind of interesting. But you know what? So maybe that's kind of ostensibly interesting. But I guess for me, I had a breakthrough. I had a breakthrough a couple weeks ago. So there's been this meme for the longest time that LLMs are doing all the fun stuff. So they're writing poetry, they're doing code, and we're like stuck with taxes. And anyway, so I did this thing where just over a weekend for a couple $1,000s worth of Claude tokens, I created this assistant from the scratch that like, it just handles all my crap. So it does all my taxes, it rebalances my portfolio. I specifically wanted to do all the stuff that like, and I'll tell you the truth, it freed me up to do some cool things. And I was telling Philip that one of the things I'm doing right now is I'm sort of working my way through the quote unquote Western canon, right? And I sort of made my way up through Mesopotamia and ancient India and Semitic stuff, and I'm at the end of like the Hellenic corpus. And there's this guy Lucian that I'm reading right now that like nobody reads. He hasn't been translated for probably like about 120 years, and I think there exist like 0 recordings of his like kind of Seinfeld-esque sitcoms involving the Greek gods. And so I just have a project where I got all 4 LLMs together to like translate the Greek, and then some of these new like state-of-the-art models that actually perform these newly translated plays. And one of the things that's the most exciting to me is that I can actually listen to these. I can actually listen to these recordings, because here's a problem, and I don't know if it's because I'm a snob or if I don't know if it's because I'm saturated with all this crap. But if I hear like an AI-generated voice, I actually can't stand it. Like I have about 30 seconds. And for whatever reason, these new like state-of-the-art voices, I guess they're trained for things like dialogue. And so you can have like, for Hermes and, Zeus and Apollo and Athena, you can have these really distinct voices, and it actually sounds like they're talking with one another. And anyway, that just, for some reason, it just gives me a lot of joy, I guess.
This is a more indirect answer, but I think one thing that's really cool is that we're now thinking about questions like, what does it mean to be human in the age of AI? What does it mean to be a good human in the first place? And what's important about human connections? Like, why does it matter that we write our own wedding vows or obituaries or, for other people, things like that? Because there's lots of questions that philosophers have been concerned with, like, a problem of free will, or what's the relationship between your mind and your body? How do we bear our own mortality? Questions like that, I guess for a while concerned theologians and mainly philosophers, but now it feels like it's so much more mainstream, and these questions really, have a claim on everyone's attention. So, of course, I would say that, but I think it's actually, really exciting that now with this technology it's kind of brought back to the foreground these existential questions for all of us.
Yeah, I guess 2 quick things. One, building off that, I went to some weird Art Illuminati event, and most of the speakers before me were talking about how do we get the public to engage more with contemporary art. And then I embarrassingly got up and I was like, well, I'm in AI, and all anybody in the world wants to talk about right now is art and AI, because art is obviously symbolic of who we are as a human. And I'm like, well, why the disconnect? This is a great time to be in art. I mean, I guess the second part too is also, there will be a lot of dismissal, I think, to the idea of, pet projects, vibe-coded projects, so on and so forth. The vast majority of them are not going to change the world. But on personal experience, even with like family members or seeing people who, are time constrained or skill constrained in some areas, I'm actually very much excited to see, what people do. I've had conversations with like my dad, who was like, I've always wanted to make a record. I'm like, okay, like fine, and I'm sure it's not going to be, something you all listen to. But it's nice in the sense I come from like a DIY arts and music background, and so seeing that enthusiasm in people who didn't feel like they had the method or the tools or the time available to work on these pet projects is pretty exciting. Yeah.
Audrey.
Yeah, I think of a few months ago where I presided over a Oregon-Oxford style 3 versus 3 debate, where in a sense I debated my digital twin of sorts. And there's it's structured so that the 3 human debaters, some of the best from Taiwan, and the other 3 are their synthesized distilled vision. And then the 6 of them plus me, we did Taiwan Foundation for Democracy debate on the topic that AI helps democracy more or hurts democracy more. And the humans argue that AI helps, and the AIs argue that they hurt. It's a very interesting experience, not only speaking to the ability for real-time full duplex AI systems, but also to the effect that it has on people attending that event, which comes from dozens, I think 20 countries, many ambassadors, my counterparts, and we did a pre and post survey. And very interesting, everybody moved to the middle. So anyone who comes into the room thinking that it's just the help or just the hurt, most of them ended up leaving thinking that it's a much more nuanced question, which is unlike the human teams with ego who want to win the debate. This is much more like a Tibetan Buddhist debate where people understand things like seeing from both sides stereoscopically. So that was pretty cool.
So on cool things, so I'm really interested in the practice of philosophy. And it turns out that that practice doesn't really fossilize very well in books and papers, right? So if all you had were a bunch of philosophy books, it would actually be very difficult to gain any skill in philosophical practice and philosophical inquiry, because by and large the natural tendency will be to kind of read this thing and look for things you agree on and stuff you find interesting and so on. Where really the practice is about a kind of inquiry that seeks equilibrium with respect to difficult questions. And it turns out that there's a central part of that that's actually, that's just as inhuman as extreme athletic pursuits, right? So extreme athletic pursuits are cultivating something that you have a natural capacity for, but you're really taking that natural capacity in a structured way outside of its kind of baseline kind of inclinations, right? And so that usually requires training, that requires a kind of tradition of practice that will have evolved over many generations of practitioners figuring out how to do this and figuring out how to train other people into this kind of practice. It turns out that it's extremely difficult to scale this kind of thing, right? So by and large, you really need one-on-one discussions with people, or maybe extremely small group discussions. But I think realistically, at some point, you really need an extensive range of one-on-one discussions with philosophers who can kind of teach you how to do this, not through transmitting facts, but again through kind of training you in this practice. If you don't have that, it's a little bit like thinking you can learn how to box from getting a heavy bag and whacking away at it. If the heavy bag doesn't respond, that's not what boxing is about. I think that I can probably build an AI agent that can transmit the practice of philosophy about as well as a 3-year degree course could. And I'm finding it very exciting to think about what sorts of things that could effectively unlock. So one old fantasy in philosophy is to get the ear of a young aristocrat and create a philosopher king. That hasn't really worked out terribly well. But what about philosopher citizens, right? So there's something distinctively important about democracy, but just because everyone gets a say doesn't mean that everyone has good judgment. Being a philosopher, by the way, also doesn't guarantee that you have good judgment, but it does make it more likely in various ways. I think that it would be a very interesting thing to see. Okay, if I can effectively transmit the practice of philosophy at scale, what sorts of things could we see downstream of that? So that's a cool thing that I think is only possible with AI, and that I'm genuinely excited about.
First of all, I want to thank everyone for the panel. It's a really unique group and definitely thought-provoking. The subject matter is about bringing together AI and protocols, and I want to kind of push on the protocol side a little bit. It feels like there's really an impedance mismatch between AI and protocols. Like, I have no doubt that the AI will get better. Like, the path of least resistance is that there will be better models and there will be more adoption. And when you when you look at protocols, by which I mean, extending social relations, institutions, how we relate together, I have no such confidence that the protocols are going to get any better or more humane. And this is kind of exacerbated by the fact that certain individuals with AI may have, much greater capability on their own. So I want to just ask, I'm sure Audrey has a specific view on this, but I open this to the whole panel. What do you think on the protocol side really needs to be defended in this context?
Should we start with Audrey, since you... Since you were called out by name.
Yeah. Sorry, I lost the last 5 seconds of mic. But I think that's exactly right as a diagnosis. But I will flip the framing a little bit. It's not that we need social relational protocols to match AI's speed. That would be like racing with a horse or something. We just needed to harness, to ride, to match AI's consequences. Right, so the lived experience of the alignment assemblies that we did in Taiwan, now it's spreading across many US states. I'm here in Washington, DC, in the future embassy for the future. And we talk about here how AI systems can help those protocols evolve faster, so that the experience we did in Taiwan, like with Uber, with deepfake, citizen rules becoming law in 2 months, is then considered normal, like scalable governance normal. So the better AI system becomes, so does our coherence capability become better. So I think that impedance mismatch is real only if we keep designing protocols the old-fashioned way. But if we take it as granted that AI will help people exercise their civic muscles, that we can listen and bridge and iterate on the rules, and we have thoughtful liability rules that re-internalize the externality so that lock-ins are no longer possible or at least severely punished, then protocol can become just living things, not invisible things, but rather like organisms even that lives within our human society, but we retain the nucleus status instead of being just mitochondria to machines. Hopefully I'm making sense.
I guess I can speak briefly to the question. I also don't necessarily have great confidence that protocols can match the speed of change, but the one thing I do think is one, it's kind of worth testing the assumption that you could develop such things. And number two, I think that I quite like this emphasis, and I think Audrey's work is really kind of a beacon in this, of saying we don't actually need to invent necessarily entirely new protocols, rather just see what current opportunities exist to make better what people say they want, right? So in the case of democracy, I was very fortunate actually to be present in Taiwan for an election, and it kind of democracy pilled me from a very skeptical position to say, oh, this could work a lot better, and that was, and so to go back earlier to Philip's point on kind of stated intentions, I think in a way it's kind of an interesting rhetorical, or it's an interesting kind of thing to do, to say, okay, well, we have these systems and protocols in place that have certain claims associated with them. How might we strengthen those claims? But I'm with you. It's a very sticky process, and regrettably, the kind of emergent and kind of unusual nature in which these new habits form. The unfortunate thing, and as I'm sure people on this panel have a great deal of experience with this too, from my limited experience, it's somewhat disconcerting to end up at the front of the plane and realize that the pilot's not there oftentimes, right? So you would expect that there's a special room you can go to in the world where decisions are being made as to determine the protocol for how we're going to interact with the latest piece of technology. And to the best of my knowledge so far, and I've followed that train pretty far, that doesn't exist, right? So perhaps, we're all kind of, we always have reason to not be confident, and yet we must still try.
Thank you so much. I just had a quick question. It's been nice hearing also all of your different perspectives. And it was great hearing some comments on autonomy specifically. And I'm curious to hear from whoever feels like putting something forward around robotics, also physical AI, embodied AI, many terms for this area, but something I'm curious about specifically in terms of what changes, maybe even from Philip, from your perspective, from the High Lab and Institute for AI Ethics, if there are specific considerations in this area. Curious, Peter, what you also know from the industry side, if you're keen to share.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so I had a question on this on my list for earlier that I didn't get to. I think that I think robotics might be one of these areas where the overhang for most people might be the most traumatic. By overhang, I mean, what's the gap between what the general public will perceive as available capability and what capability actually exists in the labs. So, I think the on-ramp from, I've seen, they just released GPT-3 and now we've had a few years and now we've got Claude Code. So, that's kind of a relatively smooth on-ramp in terms of capability coming online for kind of everyone to inspect and talk about. And, what do you have sort of now in your immediate environment? I think for robotics, it feels a lot more like it will be kind of a sharp thing where, basically you'll have like the equivalent of like a GPT-4 in robotics that will be your first point of contact with AI-powered robots. And so because responding to objects in your physical environment is just, the response is going to be a lot more visceral, I think that, there will be, I think it will be very interesting to see how that plays out in terms of the reaction of the general public. I mean, there's also, I think it was Matt's observation about this kind of not difference in timelines, but difference in time zones that you're in with respect to the technology, where you talk to some people and they barely have any idea about what's available, and then other people who've got agents running as we speak. I think that feeling of time zone displacement is going to be massively increased by robotics, and probably, I mean, I think it just largely depends on what some of the bigger companies decide about when they're shipping what and what sort of initial economic hit they're willing to absorb, because obviously, figuring out how the use case relates to long-term profitability is always an interesting question in tech. And so it's, like everything else, at first it's going to cost money before it makes money, and so I think that's why it's not on the street yet. But I think that, I think we've got some very interesting disturbances coming our way, and I also suspect that the kind of tech journalism is weird. Like, the kind of tech journalism that makes it into mainstream newspapers is probably just attitudinally a bit behind on this. Would be my first reaction.
And then, speaking of which, has anybody heard of meat units? Is that a thing? God, when I was I just found out about this, and when I was in Boston a couple of days ago. Nobody heard about it yet, but there's this weird thing where there's this. Let's say I think there's Rent a Human, and then there's another one where it's Meet Something. But anyway, so it turns out that that if you go to rentahuman.ai. You can be hired by AI to do various tasks, and some of the tasks are a little bit silly. So it'll be go just sit at this table for me, go take a picture of like a couple McDonald's hamburgers. But then a lot of these tasks are, hey, by the way, wear this camera on your head for $1,000 and just let it watch you do all of your stuff around the house. And the idea being that there are people who are sort of renting humans to effectively like train domestic robots, right? And it turns out that when you participate in this new economy where you get paid to serve AI, it turns out that you are a meat unit who's sort of doing work for labor for AI or whatever. But anyway, if it's a case that, you know, there's a bunch of people wearing helmets for $1,000 and training domestic robots, you know, maybe like Philip said, that's going to be the next step function. So somehow no robots to ubiquitous robots overnight. Is that what it's going to be? So that's a little bit weird. But then the other thing is like this autonomy thing's a little bit. Everybody's talking about autonomy now, and I feel like it's one of these superficial designations. It's just kind of like agentic squared. And usually when I hear autonomous, it's in the context of these quote-unquote autonomous agents. But listen, I mean, as long as there's a person who can decide to stop paying for tokens or just unplug the server or whatever, I don't think any of these agents are really truly autonomous. I mean, actually, you know what, I take that back. You know, one of the things that I like about things like philosopher kings and autocrats in general is that there's somebody to defenestrate, right? So it's actually kind of nice when there's a single locus of defenestration. The problem with modern software stacks is that I guess they truly are global. So you know what? Maybe it's actually more difficult than I think to pull the plug. Actually, you know what? Maybe these things are a little bit autonomous. I take that back. Maybe there's no single point of plug. You know.
Maybe just a quick addition on the autonomy point. In certain contexts, people use autonomous systems to, mean systems that operate with a certain degree of independence from human agents. And in certain contexts, that gets us some really interesting sort of conceptual questions. So in the military AI context, for example, there's autonomous weapon systems. And so one of the most prominent arguments in favor of those systems is that, they just have this incredible superhuman processing power. So the speed with which they process information is, one of the main arguments why people think it's so important to use them. But at the same time, that then leads to all these calls for, concepts like appropriate levels of human judgment or meaningful human control and so on. And so the worry about the power that those systems have implies that people, start worrying about control and so on. But it's basically the same thing that raises these completely different kinds of arguments. Right? And so autonomy really goes in both directions. And I think it, raises really hard and important questions about sort of what the conceptual tools are that we should use in the first place to encounter these problems.
Audrey, are you still with us?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
I see what used to be my face now.
Right. What are your thoughts on robots?
Well, I think the invisible infrastructure robots.
You are part of the invisible infrastructure.
Yes, and now I'm made legible again.
All right,
robotics is where those invisible infrastructure became physical contact, right? So everything we said about protocols, about contestability, bounded delegation, and so on become non-ignorable when you're facing a Waymo speeding toward you. And so when AI systems touch and move through shared space, then we really do need to get things in place before non-undoable damage happens. And so it's not just about controlling machines, it's about designing the public conditions where intentions can be inspected and the rules of relation can be challenged. And as we have designed, autonomous driving sandboxes, power can be made visible. And like in Taiwan, we passed the AI Basic Act, not calling autonomy level 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 as in self-driving vehicles. We instead do what some Japanese Arisayama scholars advised, which is called them type A, B, C, and D, which have different configurations of how the mitochondrial AI fit into human community, and each community can decide what kind of types or combination of types, like my blood type is type B. I don't want to upgrade to type A. What does that even mean? And that decision need to be made legible before we blindly go like speeding through type 5 automation.
I have a question, and we've lost a panelist, so I can't do my wrapping up quite yet. But let me ask one.
I mean, we made so many Marina Abramovich jokes. You know, I was really tempted to say the artist is not present.
Maybe I could just ask a quick question, which bears on like so many interesting points, and it's heartening to hear a conversation about AI that bears so much on the civic and civic values and citizenship and what that might mean, and certainly for me. But I'm bothered a little bit by Audrey's metaphor of the campfire. We're sitting in a room of an institution that was founded in 1400, perhaps at the kind of high water mark of maybe about 100 years before the high water mark of kind of institutional complexity and richness in the city in the world that perhaps had the highest level of institutional richness, or let's say Europe. And this institution was founded to comfort people who had been sentenced to death by hanging. That's what the institution was for. The artistic scheme downstairs is for that. It supports that. The architecture supports that. The structures, social and formal and bureaucratic around the institution would support that. Is the best we can do for these middle scale groups of people in an AI-assisted democracy, is the best metaphor we can do the campfire? Don't we have richer, more variegated, more articulate institutions that we can look at than a form of sort of, let's say, red in tooth and cord democracy, which has always found itself open to totalitarianism? I mean, the campfire is the very definition of a quite scary form of rule. What about institution building? What might the aesthetic of that be? What might these new institutions look like in a kind of deliberative universe assisted by AI?
I can take that. I think campfire, of course, is just the beginning. I want to maybe deploy another metaphor. People have called data that AI runs on the so-called new oil. Something that they extract and they burn. And I'm always bothered by that metaphor. And so recently I've been saying that data should be soil, not oil, because soil carries relationships and obligations and histories. And we don't strip mine soil, we tend it and things grow. And from soil comes to the idea of infinite gardens and so on. And that's what I think civic AI should do. Again, it's more like a permaculture, not a monoculture, not extracting from communities, but help them grow their own capacity to listen, to contest, and to repair. And so that in the garden, we can feel that the scaffolding, the tech is on tap and not on top. So maybe an infinite garden as a next step from a campfire.
Actually, a question about your question. So I think I didn't fully understand the worry. So you see a connection between the campfire and totalitarianism? Sorry.
Well, a campfire-based culture is not one that has huge institutional richness in it. It sounds cute. It sounds like a summer camp, but it's also one that's very, very, has no institutional resistance like a place like this would. It cannot take care of its rituals and values in the same way as a fully formed institution can, like a parliament compared to a shouting match in the street. And I'm just sort of trying to understand where in a kind of AI-assisted deliberative democracy, the kind of aesthetic, architectural, institution building sophistication that we've reached in different places around the world can somehow be learned from and applied to make campfire-like scale conversations happen that are a bit richer than just a summer camp. Marshmallows,
I mean,
is that the best we can do?
Potentially, and I'd be curious what Audrey thinks about this, but I mean, you could take a campfire as one possible architectural sort of analogy for thinking about, okay, how do you have sort of structure to your your citizenry. I mean, another architectural analogy would be something like Victorian garden squares, where you've got these houses around a garden, and then you've got many more of those garden square type units around a larger garden, and then maybe you have many more of those, and then you've got a park somewhere, and you can basically just have various levels of kind of similarity and connectedness at different scales, if you will. And so that would then mean that you neither get sort of complete atomization, nor do you get sort of one kind of master structure that effectively connects directly to everyone in just the same way. So as you worry about there just being any kind of architectural analogy for an appropriate amount of structure there, or is you worry that spontaneously adopted protocols just basically can't give you these kinds of garden squares?
This is getting abstract. My concern is only that there's a richness, just as there is in art, to institutional life. A group of people around a campfire is different from a group of people in an institution dedicated to comforting the dying. There are protocols involved and rules.
Yes.
So I'm merely interested in sort of examining the metaphorical realm that seems to be accepted as a kind of scale reference, and trying to understand it as a series of rules of engagement that might be civic. But yeah.
Oh, I think I see what you mean now. Do you want to respond to that, Audrey, or?
I mean, there's also very large bonfires like the Burning Man, so we can extend that metaphor quite far. But I, of course, agree that we need the kind of capacities in accruing soil of gardens where we can look at one garden square and say, this site has great capabilities, as a famous gardener have said. And I think that is then very much in conjunction with the campfire, bonfire metaphor, because again, the fork of the fire and the merge of the garden do feed into one another.
It's interesting, the language that's being used about this sophistication and the coupling of sophistication with institution, and I think the questions around power haven't really been teased out here enough. If we stretch our memories back a little bit further in time, pre the Enlightenment, we have all sorts of different examples of governance systems that predate institution. And I think they're also really interesting when you think about the analogy of campfire, because Indigenous cultures have really great examples of governance systems and structures and different law and cultural protocols that have maintained sustainability socially and environmentally for tens of thousands of years. And so I'm really curious to know whether the panel has been considering what types of different cultural protocols might be possible when we're thinking about the conceptual engineering of these different AI systems that could be a much better representation of the types of society values and protocols that we want to imagine for the future. Maybe especially when we think about the capacity for the fragility of our institutional systems currently and democracy. So what else could AI systems potentially be built on to reflect the types of values and systems that I know ancient forms of automation used to?
We've got about 4 minutes.
Okay, cool.
Okay, well, maybe trying to connect that to Karen's and Audrey's exchange, I think one, both scary and exciting thing is that this is such new technology, right? And so maybe one reason to stick with some fire-related metaphor is that it's a little bit like the Prometheus moment, right? Where we've just been given the fire, and it's not even like a whole generation has lived with this technology yet. And so working out what it means for institutional governance, both in terms of how do we govern this technology, but then also how do we use it to help us govern ourselves, is both urgent but also just timelessly important.
Yeah, I guess I can speak maybe a little bit to that. In our work, we've been, and in fact, when we first started working with machine learning, this would be about 2016 or so, we very quickly zeroed in on group singing traditions. The idea being that group singing is fascinating. One, in this kind of conversation about AI and art, in the sense that it becomes really clear that in many cases we were singing before we were speaking, right? Like it kind of predates language. There's also commonalities, right? So you can go to Bulgaria and Taiwan and Indonesia, and different kind of dissonant thirds are used to coordinate oneself around the mountains, for example. And you're like, okay, this has this aesthetic experience, but it turns out this is quite clearly a technology that people are using. We particularly like this metaphor in relation to data, right? So our framing is in the sense that models are an aggregate of us, and viewed positively, there's nothing default wrong with the idea of large groups of people contributing to something in aggregate, and each, receiving the benefit of our aggregate contribution. The question of power and who owns the model and what restrictions are on it is separate to that. Like default, that's actually a pretty beautiful idea, I think. And so we've conducted a lot of large kind of public trainings over the years, where we'll build public spaces in the tradition of kind of a group singing environments, and invite people to say, look, you don't have to contribute to this, but should you want to, why don't we congregate and do this? So the good thing, and this speaks, I think, a little bit to this conversation being a lot older, is we would get thousands and thousands and thousands of people willingly coming to sing together, under the open discussion of being like, we're not looking at you individually, we're capturing you all together, so on and so forth. And so I think thinking about public space with that long historical lens, it's not only useful as a look, it's just nice. And of course, and it taps into a lot of other things that are missing, and I mean, that's been expressed on the panel in many different senses, where you're like, oh yeah, like people love to congregate and do stuff, and actually, there's kind of a melancholy when you talk to a great number of people. I'm very fortunate in my life to be quite busy, and I'm very fortunate in my life also to have people respond to a tweet I post, right? But the vast majority of people's lives are not like that, actually. Like social media is an incredibly lonely, frustrating place, and I would also attribute a lot of kind of extremism and lashing out to be people just looking for connection with other people, and it just so happens to be the fastest way to find connection with other people online, if nobody knows who you are, is to say something ridiculous, so I think that there's a lot of lessons to be learned in that, where I really enjoy thinking about the AI conversation as if it isn't new, it's just simply like the latest coordination technology that we've developed that happens to have these other implications. I think there's wisdom in that, but that's my small part.
Amazing. And with that, thanks very much for connecting with us for a mammoth 2-hour discussion session.
Let me take a moment to just say thank you so much to all our panel members. I won't go through you all, but it's been a really extraordinary experience having you in the room, and a great, great privilege. Thank you, Philip, for the partnership on this and for bringing this incredible conversation together. Thank you for sticking it out. Good work, everybody. It's a warm afternoon. See you for a drink. Thanks.
Thanks so much. I didn't shake your hand because I had to.